service content within PPs, and what additional risks are actually seen for the panel?
John, do you want to start? It's a policy issue, I suppose, but do you want to comment on that?
It's a policy issue. This is this line between what's core services and what's not. I mean, my view is that it varies from project to project, but as a general rule, the more services you can include without going to the non-core services, but the core services. So the more non-core services you can include, the better value for money outcome you are likely to achieve. But in different sectors, whether it's health, whether it's correctional services, etc., governments do have different policy positions around that. So you do see very, differences from one sector to the other. Some of that's around the strength of the industrial relations regime, etc. So all those sorts of things do have to be taken into account when governments are making those decisions.
Yeah, I think from the financier's perspective, the more people can get their mind around more services being included, but the more that are included, the more analysis that people need to do about, given the long-term nature of who's providing these services and the cost inputs that go into these models for 30 years. To the extent that there are more and more services and they get a bit more complicated, and there are less parties who can actually provide them, the analysis of who are the alternative service providers, can you replace a service provider and what cost, and trying to get a handle on a 30-year cash flow on services becomes a bit more difficult. So there is, the more you do include, the more analysis required and the more sharing that might be required with government on some of those incremental services and passing through of costs if they change in 15 years or 20 years in an unforeseeable way.
I think the initial argument that was put up for PPPs was often that it was freeing up government funds to focus on other things. And whilst that's still true, I think it misses that service component. If you look at the schools program, for example, one of the reasons why the teachers, and they're a relatively assertive union, let me put it that way, are so in favour of the schools PPPs, it actually frees up the teachers to focus on what they're good at, i.e. teaching kids and not facility management. So if you can free up the teachers there, they can really focus on what they're there to do. I think if you look at the prison PPPs, it seems that we've had a government monopoly for a long time in running prisons, and they have a particular view about the service standards within those prisons. That is, you're there to be punished. Unfortunately, with that sort of philosophy, the recidivism rate tends to be pretty high from those prisons. And when you have a private prison, not only do you break that monopoly, but you actually provide a benchmark from which you can then compare the government prisons, and you can have different performance measures, like, for example, the rate at which prisoners return back to jail. In other words, giving that as one of your criteria to minimise the rate of recidivism. So it seems to me that service component in the PPPs is becoming even more important, and I think in terms of the value for money criteria, there's a lot more there to still to be drawn out.
This question in front.
Thank you. Louise Asher, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in Victoria. Can I just, in line with Campbell's bemoaning of how difficult the life is for politicians, I was a member of the Kennett government, and of course CityLink was a project on which we took a lot of political heat, and indeed our Labor opponents opposed that project, opposed the private sector involvement in it, kept us sitting all night, as I recall, and now of course we have the largest decel plant in the world announced, and of course we're just expected to support it because we're Liberals. So we tried to be good on announcement day, but John, given this is almost like a briefing opportunity for me, which I don't get, can I ask you about two elements of that announcement? which appeared to be slightly unusual from usual forms of PPPs. The first element was the partial government underwriting, and if you could perhaps just explain to me the rationale for that. I noted the comment earlier from the gentleman from Macquarie basically saying how pivotal that was, but I would like to hear from you the rationale for that. And secondly, the payments to the losing bidder. Which, again, I was a Cabinet Minister in the Kennett government. Maybe we paid them, I don't recall, or at least wasn't aware. If you could run through the rationale for the payment to the losing bidder on that, I'd be very grateful.
Okay, this will be a challenge.
There's no minder here, you're free.
It's a public forum though. On the government support of the funding option, could we just put it in a bit of context perhaps to start with? But because I think this is important, we've had a very severe global financial crisis. That has meant that governments around the world have supported provincial governments, have supported banks, have supported the largest investment banks in the world. In Australia, we've seen the federal government support the car industry, support banks, and offer support to the states. So I don't think it's that unrealistic that when you're dealing with a $3.5 billion project in these sorts of circumstances, that governments would not support in some shape or form on a temporary basis, or while the problems still exist, the funding attached to that project. So yes, there is support. I mean, there's been very little detail provided by government in respect to the support that has been provided and how that will work, because, as I said earlier, we haven't reached financial close yet, and it would be unreasonable for the government, I guess, to reveal all of that, both for government and for the winning bidder, until the deal is properly closed. But government has announced that there is financial support. The numbers you've seen in the press aren't government numbers, but somebody's been talking, and I guess they're probably not that far from reality. They're reported by a number of sources. But the form of support is predominantly what we're calling a syndication guarantee, which will simply enable the banks that have already provided a substantial amount of committed funding behind the winning consortium to, now that they are the preferred, well, no, they're the contracted party, that's what they are now. It gives them the opportunity to go to other lenders who were supporting the other bid. Perhaps to lenders, remember in this environment, there are lenders and banks who say, this looks like a very interesting transaction, but I'm not sure it's going to get there, I'm not sure it's going to close, and I'm not sure that I want to spend a lot of time on this because my parent company back in the UK has got enough problems without me worrying them about a deal down here, down under. But when a deal gets to the level of sign-off that we have now, or contractual signing, there's an understanding that some of those banks will potentially come into that syndicate. So what the state's doing is saying we'll stand behind that syndication arrangement for a period of time, and to the extent that it's not fully syndicated, but both the winning consortium and the state have a great deal of confidence that it will be fully funded. But to the extent that it's not, then the state would potentially step in with co-funding along with those banks. In a similar way, as I started, I guess, the federal government or any other government in Australia standing behind other industries and other sectors during a time of financial difficulty. And I might add these arrangements that apply to the desalination plant are temporary in nature, so they're designed in such a way that when we see the financial markets return to the confidence levels we saw 2 or 3 years ago, then these arrangements